Hello, everyone. Welcome back for part two. We're going to jump in and talk about the different forms that busking and street performance can take. In general, we generally see this form or this kind of genre take place in three different general formats. Let me go ahead and show you my lecture notes so you know what I'm talking about. Upper right hand corner here. So the three different formats that we typically encounter are circle shows, walk by acts, and stoplight performers. The one that's probably least familiar to you is stoplight performers. We'll talk about those last, but circle shows and walk by acts are pretty prominent in New York City in particular. So let's start out with circle shows. Circle shows, perhaps the label itself is somewhat self-explanatory, but it's a performance in which a crowd gathers around the performers in a circle. And there are a couple of important elements about that. A circle creates a framing device, a literal stage in a way for the performers to be performing on. And framing devices are very important to us when we are appreciating or trying to experience a piece of art or music. So why do I say that? You are all aware of what a framing device is. When you were probably in kindergarten or first grade or even in preschool, you probably made some really, really terrible art that your parents may have decided to frame and put up in the house at some point. And by putting a frame around it, we are asked then to experience what's in the frame as a piece of art. And framing devices are really important, not only in the realm of visual arts, but most certainly in auditory arts as well. Consider the idea that it's a lot harder to captivate someone's attention when you're not asking for a kind of circle formation from your onlookers. That kind of framing, especially when it's applied to music, creates a template which is generally followed, which is that a circle show generally has a distinct beginning and end to it. There's a beginning of the show and an end of the show, or a beginning of the act and an end of the act. And this is a major point of distinction from a walk-by act. A walk-by act, on the other hand, doesn't have a distinguishable beginning or end. You might see the beginning of a performance because the performer is starting a new song or a new act, but the idea is that you're not required to watch it in its entirety. So one of the larger themes that we will experience as a class is this idea of the medium impacting the message. So what do I mean by that? I generally like to unpack that idea in regards to the visual arts. If we were all taking an art class, if I decided that it was going to be watercolor day, and I gave everyone the medium of watercolor paints, the thing that you would decide to paint or create with watercolor is determined in part, and specifically influenced by the fact that you are using watercolors as the medium of expression. So what you would create with watercolor is going to be different than what you create with oil paint, with acrylics, with clay, with, obviously in that sense, you have a dimension to things, but nevertheless, the medium is going to impact the message, the thing that you're creating. And so the medium being street performance here, and street performance having a number of different avenues of different formats, is going to influence the kind of performances that we see based on the setups. So it's an interesting relationship where location is also, and the style or the format of the performance is having an impact on what is performed. So we're going to see that a lot. Going back to my lecture notes, the other one that we're least familiar with probably is stoplight performers or performances. And these have a relationship to circle shows because circle shows do indeed have a form of their own, just like stoplight performers. So stoplight performers have a really concentrated act, and they're actually performing at what's usually a longer stoplight, but a stoplight nonetheless. And when they're changing over every 30 to 45 seconds, that means that you're going to see an entire routine while sitting in your car. And like a circle show, therefore, then has a distinct form and format. So rather than talk about all of these in the abstract, we're going to go through some samples of street performers that are using these different formats to see how that's going to change the kind of thing that we are seeing. So let me go ahead and start off with our circle shows.
Don't move, okay? I'm going to flip over. Keep your head straight. I'm not that good. Nobody's perfect, man. But you know what, guys? Before I flip over, we should get his name.
You're right. Safety first.
Shut up. You're right. What's your name? Everyone say hi, Teo. No. Together, like a family. Everybody say hi, Teo.
Hi, Teo.
Everyone say bye, Teo. You guys are sick. Oh my God. You guys are messed up out there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see me flip over, everybody say yeah! You know what, guys? I'm loving the energy right now. This is the first show today, so I want to take this stunt to another level. A higher level. Hey, you, sir, right there. Yes, no, you, sir. Can you raise your hand like this? Yes, you. We have a volunteer. Here we go. Everybody clap. You're going to stand right here, and you're going to face that way, okay? Yeah, just like that.
I know.
Everybody clap those hands. Everybody clap. Everybody clap. You, sir. Let's go. No. Let's do it. Right over there, sir. Right. He likes it. Everybody clap. Everybody clap. Oh, you got the bag? It's okay. Everybody clap those hands. Oh, this guy is hot. You, buddy. Let's go. Everybody clap those hands. Everybody clap. Everybody clap. I want this guy. That's no, it's okay, buddy. Let's do it. Right over here. All right, that's what I'm talking about. Oh, yeah. Get over there. That Yankee hat. Get over there, buddy. Everybody clap. You too, buddy. No, it's coming for you. Let's go. Right over there. Everybody clap. Clap. I want that sexy guy right there. You, buddy. Let's go. He's coming in. He's ready. Yeah. All right. Everybody clap. Let's go. Smell the money. Let's go, buddy. You're going to stand right over there. Everybody clap. Now, guys, one straight line. Side by side. Side down a little bit, buddy. Everybody clap those hands. Everybody clap. No. Whoa. Stop clapping. White people, find your rhythm, please. Like this, guys, yeah. Yeah, all of this. Yeah, we're gonna hurt these people. And we don't want to do that.
No!
I ain't going back to jail.
No!
Okay, in any case, it should be very clear a couple of things that are happening. One, polling audience members is going to maintain the framing device that they have created. So by having people participate in what's happening as a part of their performance, they're not only increasing their chance at gratitudes, but also maintaining that important framing device. This whole video takes about, per performance takes about 15 minutes, right? So this is something that we're going to see as a form happening on a much more condensed level when we're discussing stoplight performances. The more frequent occurrence for I think a standard New Yorker who is often in transit is a walk-by performance, where there is a performer stationed or set up, and you are waiting for a train, they're playing on the platform, or at a major transit point, and you experience their performance for only a segment of what's probably an elongated form. So this, what I just showed you is from Times Square. If you've never been there, hopefully it looks somewhat familiar to you. There are a couple of subway stops that are main avenues for performances and really sought after by performers. A location is called a pitch, by the way. And there are some really tasty pitches in New York City, and a number of them are aligned in transit, because one of the things that's going to be most attractive is pulling in a large audience. The more people who are seeing your show, the more chance of having significant gratitudes come in for a particular day. So stations like Canal Street, 14th Street, 34th Street, 42nd Street are all 59th Street, Columbus Circle. Anything that has a number of stops going through it, you are greatly increasing your chance of seeing a busker. So let me go ahead and pull up one of my more favorite acts from New York specifically. They've had a change of name, so I don't want to get it wrong, but hopefully you've seen them at some point if you've lived in New York for a while. An interesting fusion group that joins popular covers with a jazz band, big band sort of influence. And unfortunately, the labeling of this station is wrong. This is definitely 34th Street. And the audio is great, but it's not timed with the video specifically. So this is Lucky Chops. The baritone saxophone is particularly fun to watch. He does a lot of fancy feet movement while performing his instrument. But they do kind of medley shows, and it's presented in a walk-by style, although sometimes it becomes a sort of more circle style performance. Their tunes, though, are, because they're medleys, one thing kind of runs into another. So there's not really as much as the show that we saw, like an official start to anything. and passersby, leave gratitudes, but are not really expected to experience a whole show, much like, as you are in a circle show. Street light performers are not so common in the United States, but much more so in Latin America. And because of their succinct quality, often we don't hear or see musicians being street light performers, but instead jugglers or mimes or acrobats or some sort of circus art being presented most often in this medium. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So that's, again, the medium is going to impact the message here. So our limited amount of time due to our location is going to invite some mediums of performance and not others. Just an example of all three different formats. The two that I covered first, most often happening in New York City. I want to talk about larger ensembles and not just like solo acts, which we see a lot of, like a individual violinist, for example, or someone accompanying themselves on a guitar, or even singing a cappella. But when you have more people involved, oftentimes, especially in larger circle shows, you're going to designate a particular person for taking gratitudes. Let me go ahead and pull up my lecture notes one more time. Okay, so like I said, for ensemble acts, we're going to have a particular person that's going to be in charge of taking gratitudes. And at some point, that person was called a bottler. And let's talk about that term really quickly and the history of it, because I think it's very fascinating. So a bottler is a British term. And what this came from is the idea that a performer would have a glass bottle that was cut in half, and a leather pouch was attached to the bottle. The idea being that you would insert your coins, your gratitude, into the jar or into the bottle itself, and it would collect inside the pouch. Now, to prevent, it was an anti-theft measure to prevent theft or someone, making a quick getaway with, just shaking out the contents of the bottle. As coins pass through them, it obviously makes a very distinct sound. So bottlers were a term that was borrowed from that particular device as the name for someone who is going to take those gratitudes. I think it's very interesting. The other names for this individual that are well known, a hat man or a pitch man. And sometimes these individuals are a part of the performance, but they don't always have to be. Especially for larger configurations, an effective pitchman, hatman, or bottler, whatever you want to call them, is going to be really crucial in rallying up the crowd and taking contributions from the individuals who have seen your act and your art. And I mentioned it earlier, but let me sort of revisit it, a pitch, very specifically thinking about the pitch man. A pitch is a realm or a destination point for a particular street performance. And there are very popular pitches in New York City. Again, New York City, a major metropolitan area, high population density, areas that have good amount of traffic, that have a low amount of noise, that are inviting to performance, are going to be pitches that people often stake out. And with the groups that we saw, well, certainly the group that we saw at 34th Street, the most sought after pitches are often spaces that need to be reserved through a permit through New York City. So not anyone at this point can just go ahead and play in 34th Street on that upper level and expect not to get stopped by the cops, unfortunately. But anytime you see that banner, that's the sign that a performer has gone through the trouble of getting a permit and are okayed by New York City to perform at that particular location. So any of those big spots that I mentioned are usually permit-only locations. There are plenty other popular non-permitted locations, but again, as you can imagine, those locations are also well sought after by performers because you don't require a permit to get them. Central Park, by the way, is of course another place to see buskers on the regular. You know, just traveling around the city ensures you're going to interact with some amount of street performance or art at some point. But, you know, that's not to say that the city has always had, specifically New York City has always had a fond relationship with street performance. Remember, this is also can be an avenue for protest and social unrest as well. So although protected by freedom of speech, it, you know, is an element that still is under some amount of control by New York City. Interestingly enough, and this is the point that I'll conclude this part of lecture on, in areas where buskers perform regularly, crime rates tended to go down, and those with higher education attainment tended to have a more positive view towards buskers than those with lesser education attainment. And I think that's significant. And part of the reason why, although the city is active in its idea of having permits, that they do encourage some amount of public art. Where there's public art, there is less crime. And that's, of course, going to be appealing for a variety of reasons. In our last two sections, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about New York City and its tradition of busking. I have a interesting video that goes through some of the laws and legislation, which is how we'll start our third part. And then again, dive into different kinds of street performers that we encounter in New York City. So I will see you back for our third section shortly.